Well, it's a pleasure and honor to be here. And I'd like to thank Michelle for hosting this event in such an amazing venue, and for all of you coming out on a rainy morning here in Toronto. And it's also wonderful to be here with some of my colleagues that I've known for years. I guess Arnie Nowak is here with his team, and it's really quite remarkable. He's also been doing work in the Middle East for decades, and he has an expertise in hearing loss, and for better or for worse, this is something he experiences. So I'm actually wearing on my lapel a microphone that will allow him to hear everything that I say, and probably other things as well, who knows. So I am really pleased and honored to be here, and I guess it was such a great pleasure to make Haifa's acquaintance when we met in London. And one of the things that I had talked with her about was this Eritrea group. And remarkably, the very first time that the folks got together in Israel and Palestine was just outside of the old city in the Cinematheque. And it was a group of parents, and half of the children who were kindergartners were Arab, and half of the children in the kindergarten at the YMCA were Jewish. And they came together to have a joint training program for their children in kindergarten. And this was actually a movie that we were watching together and then discussing. And interestingly, Arna's Children was a movie that was produced about this woman who had a Jewish background, had an Arab husband, and who had 3 children. And she actually was working with folks in Jenin and had this theater troupe that she worked with fairly closely. And she would come in from Haifa, where she was living, and she would actually be actively involved in creating these theaters. And so here were these children up on stage acting out what they were hoping would be the reality, and sort of showing sort of signs of resilience in terms of dealing with the difficult situations that they were in. And it was just fascinating, because we were watching this movie, and on one side was Ruth Feldman, who was translating the Hebrew for me, and I had another colleague from Gaza actually translating the Arabic, because there weren't any English subtitles at that point in time for the movie. And then afterwards we met in the area to have sort of a lunch, and we began discussing whether or not we should form some sort of program to have joint projects where we bring together individuals from both sides of that divide to do joint projects. And so that was the story, but I didn't realize that the young woman who was so actively involved in organizing the event in London was one of Haifa's children. She was actually one of the young people that were actually present in that group and were up on stage with regard to some of these dramatic activities. And of course, she is an exemplar of resilience. But I think it comes back again to the issue of what can we do to help our children grow and develop so that they can actually have a deeper understanding and some degree of empathy for people on the other side. And I'm going to go through the neuroscience. As always, I have many more slides than I have time to present. So what I'm going to do is go through some of them fairly rapidly. On the other hand, I'm going to probably want to leave as much time for questions and answers, that hopefully there will be a few answers by the end of the presentation. So typically, in the United States, I need to make a disclosure statement, and I've been very fortunate to have a number of grants, and it's fascinating that one of the areas that I had initially worked hard on had to do with something called Tourette syndrome. I'm not sure if anybody in the room knows anything about Tourette or not. But fascinatingly, as we were sort of doing our work on Tourette, we encountered the reality that many people who had this condition also had a condition called obsessive compulsive disorder. And we were very involved in trying to use the latest neuroscience to understand these conditions. So we were doing brain imaging studies, we were doing, measuring cerebral spinal fluid. We've actually looked at brain tissue from individuals with these conditions. And one of the surprises was that we were collecting cerebral spinal fluid from our patients, and we were looking at all of the usual suspects. So we were looking at dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin, but I had some left, and I wanted to not just leave it in the freezer forever, so I wanted to sort of take a look and see what else was possible for us to look at. And about that time, there was a paper that came out with regard to obsessive compulsive disorder and arginine vasopressin, which I'm sure probably hardly any of you have ever heard of. But it turned out that there was something called a Gordon Conference to learn about these things, and there was an abnormality, and I was sure that because of tick-related OCD, we would actually see that there was an even stronger finding with regard to tick-related OCD, but there was an elevation of the arginine vasopressin in the individuals with obsessive compulsive disorder. Anyway, I went to the Gordon Conference. I talked to Bill North, the guy who was actually organizing the conference, and I asked him if he would be willing to assay the arginine vasopressin in the cerebral spinal fluid specimens that we had collected. And he said, sure, but Jim, if I'm going to do that, you also have to let me measure the sister neuropeptide, which is oxytocin. So I'm not sure, probably some of you know oxytocin, and the only thing in my medical training that I knew at that point in time was the fact that it was actually involved in uterine contractions and birth, as well as in breastfeeding and the milk release, and this was released in a pulsatile way. So one thing led to another, and we started doing studies of wondering what on earth is going on. Why would there be some individuals, and it turned out it was mostly young women who were around the age just after puberty that were the ones that had the onset of OCD, that had the elevation in the oxytocin levels. So what does OCD have to do with breastfeeding and uterine contractions? And then I remembered that actually when we were expecting our first child out in San Francisco, remarkably, my wife changed. She actually started being worried about everything being as clean as possible. I had to move this refrigerator from this third floor walk-up and clean underneath it in order to satisfy her need for everything to be clean. I had to paint the walls. I actually went out myself and bought all of the wood that I would need to actually build a cradle for this child on the kitchen floor. And I thought, why am I doing this? And then I remembered also, whenever my wife coughed or had a fever, I was so worried about there being some sort of complication to the pregnancy. Anyway, so this led me down this evolutionary path so that I began to realize that maybe some forms of OCD are actually evolutionarily conserved, and actually, given the high rates of infant mortality that have been present in our species for so long, it's only been recently in the last century or two that they've really gone down. I thought, oh my goodness, maybe there's a conserved trait here that actually makes good sense. So that's what started us going down that road. We started doing interviews of new parents, talking about their preoccupations and the rest of it, and how long can a new parent go without thinking about their child? And it's so interesting to track that through the pregnancy and through the months after delivery, and then following those children over time. We even did brain imaging studies where we were actually looking at what was their response to hearing their baby cry as opposed to some other baby's cry. What about looking at their baby's picture versus some other baby's picture? And it's really quite fascinating to see the changes. And we were looking both at moms and at dads. And one of the things that I'll be emphasizing if there's time, although I'm probably just going to end up talking rather than showing you slides, is that it's fascinating that when we were asking the parents about who is the more preoccupied, in every case, the spouse said that their spouse was more preoccupied than the spouse said about themselves, and that was sort of going back and forth both for the mothers and the fathers. So one of the perspectives, and it came home to me again and again as I went around the room beginning to talk with people about these realities. One is that we're all interconnected, whether we're sitting at the same table, whether we're in one group of individuals or another. But it's really quite interesting to me, and this is actually the social networking that we can see. And so many different organizations are represented here that actually represent sort of nodes where people are coming together to be thoughtful about how to move ahead with various very important areas of activity. And some of the activities that we were talking about too really are based on a group process, that no one individual, and this was actually, I can quote this from a conversation I had just probably less than 5 minutes ago, no one individual can accomplish anything. They may provide the vision, they may provide some broader sense of where we need to go, but we need to work together if we're going to make a change. And it turns out that the same is true of our brains. No one neuron is able to accomplish anything. It's only when they work together that they're able to sort of find a way of moving forward with whatever it is that they're intending to do and finding a way to make that happen. And it's fascinating. One of the groups that I've also been involved with is the Fetzer Institute, which is in Michigan, in Kalamazoo. And it's a fascinating organization. I could tell you the whole history there, but they basically brought together groups of people to be thoughtful about all sorts of things. And I was part of the natural sciences collection of individuals, and the person who invited me to join was Sue Carter, who's one of the world's experts on obsessive compulsive disorder and oxytocin. And so I was glad to go. But the other co-leader of that group was a fellow, Bruno Giordani from France, and he's actually an astrophysicist. And we had this conversation, which was fascinating to me, about dark matter and dark energy. And it's interesting, when you talk to your friends who are physicists, most of them shake their head and say, nobody really knows what that is. It may not really exist. We need to find a way of looking, whatever it is that we're trying to explain. But one of the things that Bruno told me was that, you can do simulations. You can take the data that we're using, and we can do simulations of dark matter and dark energy. And what do you see? And this is the cosmos, this interconnected set of nodes. And it's just fascinating to me. And of course, it's constantly changing. It never stays exactly the same either. So I'm going to let Haifa sit down, and she's going to press the button because we're going to go on to the... So I'm just going to say a word about Simon Baron-Cohen. He's a world expert in autism, but he's also a world expert with regard to empathy. And he's aware of what the biological systems are, and he's actually been studying that in individuals on the autism spectrum, as well as individuals who don't have autism. And he's just been a wonderful colleague, and I've done 2 sabbaticals. I'm such a fortunate person in Cambridge, and I often would share coffee with Simon, and it was just fascinating that he was actively involved in this process as well. And Haifa is also somebody that I very much admire, and I've already told you a little bit about my background with regard to Haifa and the work that she has been doing and where she came from. And what was so interesting about the conversation that we had last night was how important that relationship was that she had with Arna in helping her move forward with her life and create the kind of resilient pathway that she has actually followed in terms of where she is right now and how she got there. So you can keep just... I'm not sure where that other thing came from. No, just go back one more. Yeah. So here's my daughter, Emily, and that's my first grandson, Caleb. And Caleb is now 11 years of age, so it's been a while. But it turns out that the biobehavioral systems that underlie our attachment are ones that are highly evolutionarily conserved across our mammalian species. I mean, it's there, it's present. And empathy is a core element in parental care and nurturance, and we'll go through a few slides, and I'm just going to probably focus on some of those efforts as well. So interestingly, John Bowlby was also somebody who was at Cambridge, and one of the people that he worked with was Robert Hind, who was one of the people that helped me when I was on my sabbatical at Cambridge, and it was just fascinating to me. But when you look at this whole issue of attachment, it's clear that the formation of secure attachments is a crucial ingredient for having a successful child. And that relationship, in terms of the trust and the interaction, actually gives them the confidence to go out there and explore the world, whether they're going to Norway or whether they're going to Vancouver or coming back to Toronto. There's a whole story there. So it's interesting. She really wanted me to focus a bit more on what is the neuroscience of empathy. So it would be far better if Simon Baron-Cohen was here telling you this story than I am. But it's fascinating to me because here in the somatosensory cortex is one of the places where our mirror neurons live. So I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard of mirror neurons, but the somatosensory part of our cortex actually helps us understand and prepare for the movements that we make and the sensations that we feel. And remarkably, there's mirror neurons that are there too that actually light up and begin to be more active and interconnect with everything when they actually are looking at another and trying to understand what the underlying feelings and emotions are, as well as the physical feelings that the person is that they're next to. And interestingly, another piece of this is the oxytocin story that we'll be speaking a little bit more about. But it's also fascinating because we'll come back to this again. It also connects with the stress response circuit, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which is how we respond to threat and stress in our world. So here's a picture of Sue Carter and of Ruthie Feldman. And what's remarkable about Ruthie is she came and did a postdoctoral fellowship with us years ago at the Child Study Center right after she graduated from Hebrew University. And she was so fascinated by the oxytocin work that when she went back to Bar Ilan, she actually began measuring the oxytocin. And I was convinced that it was not a really good thing to do, because what I was aware of with regard to the oxytocin was that it was released in this pulsatile fashion, whether we were talking about uterine contractions or whether we're talking about milk release. And I didn't think we'd actually be able to see consistent results with regard to peripheral measures of oxytocin, measured in the blood, measured in the urine, measured in actually in saliva is the more recent area that we've been looking at. And so this is oxytocin, a nanopeptide, 9 amino acids, and this is the oxytocin receptor. Next slide. So it's interesting. I picked out this slide because it says here, increased empathetic response to cries. And this is the insula, the anterior insula cortex. But this is just going through some of the issues having to do with bonding that occur within families. And this is actually a slide that I took from a presentation that was in Science magazine back in 2014 by Larry Young, who's a person who does basic science research down in Emory. Next slide. So this is actually a family from Tehran that we were talking about before. And this is Aftab. And Aftab is now 3 years old. But they actually lived with us for 2 years, and she actually studied psychiatry at Yale, but I met them the day after their wedding in Tehran, and it's just been wonderful to see Maria and Hamid and her family sort of moving forward. In any case, what's interesting, when you look at the peripheral levels of oxytocin, what you see with regard to the mother, what's associated with that behaviorally is actually affectionate touch and having synchrony with regard to the baby's emotions, being very aware, being mindfully aware of how the baby is feeling and being responsive. And if we had more time, I would show you a video that actually came from Ruthie's PhD dissertation that she did when she was at Hebrew U, because she was looking at dyadic interactions between parents and children and looking at what the nature of those interactions were, and that's the data she was using when she actually looked at the oxytocin levels. But what's fascinating is that when you look at the dads, it's a different story. It turns out that what correlates with the oxytocin levels in the periphery for the fathers is actually stimulatory play. I'm not sure if any of you have any young children or if you remember what it was like, but it's not unusual to see dads throwing the baby up in the air and catching them, and it is another way of sort of preparing them for the outside world to explore the world, but it's a different whole dimension. And what's fascinating too is that when you look at the brain imaging studies, there are different patterns of activation that we see in fathers and in mothers that are correlated to some of those behaviors. Another thing that came home to me and is very clear, and I'll talk about this a bit more, and it has to do with parenting begetting parenting. That the way in which you were raised has a direct and lasting impact in terms of the likelihood of how you might be raising your child. And what's interesting about that is that it provides some transformative potential, and this I'm speaking directly to David here, because we had a discussion about transformation and how problematic a word that can be, also how powerful a word that can be. And the whole issue there is, if we can actually change how parents are raising their children, that may have this impact that's not only what you can measure in terms of the child's outcome, but also future generations as well. Next slide. So I showed you that diagram before, and it turns out it's not only these areas of the brain that are involved in, but other cognitive areas are also actively involved. And of course, this is one of the areas that Simon is the most interested in. And there probably won't be time, but it turns out that when people have done prospective longitudinal studies of early interventions, and here I'll come back to a couple of things, it turns out that not only is the achievement of the child with regard to their academic potential, their psychosocial capacities increased, their earning capacity increased, they're also much more healthy physically. So actually there have been prospective longitudinal studies, and these are mostly studies done in high-income countries like this one, where they actually looked at the intervention, and these were randomized controlled trials, so the design of the study was really quite good. And what they found was actually the physical health in terms of blood pressure, weight, metabolic status was actually improved in those children that had been through the program compared to the ones that were randomized to receive some alternative intervention. Next slide. So here's the other side of that story. It turns out that what happens during the pregnancy, what happens in the first years of life, what the situation is of the mother even before she becomes pregnant is also crucially important. And it turns out that there's a phenomenon that we call toxic stress, and people have looked at this carefully by looking at things like adverse childhood experiences and looked at the long-term outcomes. And not only do you see that if you had a multiplicity of early childhood adverse experiences, not only is your mental health in the future more likely to be impacted, but your physical health as well in terms of heart disease and mortality, etc. Next slide. And so this is just actually a paper that was published in Biological Psychiatry, and it's basically looking at the neuroinflammatory response, the release of cytokines, the activation of this adrenal cortical stress response circuit, and the impact that those cytokines actually have in the low-grade inflammation that occurs within the brain in terms of that how that alters the reward sensitivity in the basal ganglia as well as the threat sensitivity in the areas of the cortex and the amygdala, which are other brain structures that we could talk more about if people were interested. Next slide. And of course, this reality has only just been compounded by what the circumstances currently are in terms of, and certainly when we think about the Middle East, you know, it's just heartbreaking in terms of what's been going on there, in terms of the crisis that has been going on in Syria and other parts of the Arab world for so long. And this was a conference I went to in The Hague a couple of years ago. But it's a sad reality compounded by situations of migration, war, conflict, and extreme violence to which families are exposed. Next slide. And what's interesting, and so I'm going actually to Belfast on Friday, and there's going to be the, I guess, the third or fourth or fifth meeting of the Early Childhood Peace Consortium, and it's being organized by a group of people at Queen's University. And here I thank Paul Connolly and also this woman by the name of Siobhan Fitzpatrick. And she's actually the person who's the CEO of a group called the Early Years. And in some ways, the Early Years is exemplary of what I'm talking about, because what they did was they brought Protestant and Catholic families together to be part of the same kindergarten program and pre-kindergarten program in Belfast. And of course, when you're working with your children, and you're doing your best with your children, what happens? You get to know the other parents. There's a group process that is started, and this whole issue of the social capital of the mothers and the fathers is something that can be increased dramatically, so that in fact, if you actually have that kind of opportunity, there's a way in which they have built their social capital so that if future problems come up, they have other people in the community that they can count on. And what's interesting is that this whole issue is what we're going to be discussing in Belfast in this international meeting, where we're hoping to have an international network where we're looking in conflict regions of the world. And so far we've identified 5 or 6 areas, and they're actually coming as well. And they include places like Egypt, Timor-Leste, Mali, and Kyrgyzstan and Kyrgyzstan, sorry, coming together, and we're going to be working with them to develop early childhood programs that can be initially evaluated by an international team of experts. And we've got people coming from Harvard University, from NYU, as well as from Queen's, some other universities in Europe as well. And one of the things that we're trying to also come up with is, if you really want to be successful with these ventures, it's a multi-sectorial process. You need to build a community. And that community includes not only the people who are going to be receiving the service, so you need to have their investment in what you're going to be doing in terms of a program, but you also need the practitioners, you need the local officials within the government structures, and you need, ideally, people at the national level also actively involved in terms of this sort of vertical cohesion that you might want to see in place if you're actually going to have sustainable programs going on. How are we doing on time? Oh, good. So by pointing out the societal risks, we're actually hoping that we can have an impact. And I don't think I included the slide, but I actually had the opportunity at Columbia University just a few weeks ago to make a presentation to an international group of journalists, because the media is so important, and if we're really going to move ahead, we need to find a way of convincing the world, but particularly our political leaders, that investing in early childhood programs is something that would be worth the investment. And I'm not sure if I can reach these things or not. So later this morning, I'm actually going to be meeting with Stephen Lyle, who's here at the University of Toronto. And he was one of the co-chairs of the Lancet series, and they've been doing a Lancet series on early child development for some years. And this is actually a series of 3 articles, and this is sort of the overview article that was done. And basically, they were looking very carefully at what is being done. What is the impact of these early childhood programs when we look carefully at the science? So if you actually look at those that have included randomized clinical trials, what do you find? And I'll actually be meeting with Stephen later today to be talking about this, but he was actually the co-chair of this steering committee. And there have been a series of international launches, and one of the focal points for this work is the importance of the first 1,000 days. So what's actually happening with regard to the young parents as they're preparing for the birth of the child, what's happening during the pregnancy, but also during the first few months of life as well. So I'll just pass this around, and if you wouldn't mind just passing it around as you have a chance to, I'd be grateful. This was also another event that we had not too long ago with the Yale Club for UNICEF, and that was so fascinating because we were looking at the migration crisis, but also doing a launch of this early child development series that was published in The Lancet, which is one of the more well-known scientific journals in the medical field. So maybe I'll ask you to pass that around, David. And why don't we go on to the next slide? Yeah, so this is another very important point that I wanted to make. I mentioned earlier that toxic stress has an impact with regard to our stress response circuit. It also turns out that the place that makes the oxytocin in our brain, although oxytocin is made throughout our bodies, it's made in our GI tract and our muscles. It's really quite amazing how much oxytocin there actually is in our biological system. But it turns out that one of the places that the oxytocin is made, the ventral tegmental nucleus of the hypothalamus, is also the place of one of the nodes of the stress response circuit. They are next door neighbors. So I'd like you to think about some of the stressors that you've had in your life and your response. And I can tell you the story from my perspective of what it was like for me on 9/11. My daughter Emily, who you met a few slides ago, was getting her PhD in epidemiology down at Columbia. And I had to speak to Emily, although she wasn't living anywhere close to, the place where the Twin Towers were. But I had to speak to Emily. I had to speak to her. I had to hear her voice. I had to be present in the moment with her. But I also needed to talk to my son Peter, who was out in San Francisco. He was in, actually he was in Berkeley. He was in law school out there. And I had to speak to Peter. So one of the realities are that when we feel under threat, when we are frightened, when we are worried, the first thing we really want to do is make sure that the people that we're closest to are okay. And that sort of bonding of our group whether it's the family unit or whether it's the larger, group that we're in, is crucially important. The reality is that when we have a stressor like that, it turns out it's much easier to stereotype the other, to see them as less than human. The slide that I usually show is from the Second World War and a propaganda poster produced by the Americans, and basically it's a big boot that is raised over two snakes. And if you don't have to look too closely to see that one of the snakes has the Japanese insignia and the other one has the German insignia on it. So these are not people, these are snakes, and we can just stomp on them. And I think that that kind of stereotyping is something that we need to be prepared for, and fortunately with our brains, we can actually have a way of realizing what the realities are, and even though we're being invited to stereotype the other, we can recall the friends that we have made, the supports that we have, and you can actually say, well, this is the way my brain works, but I'm not going to necessarily go down that path. And that's the beauty of our prefrontal cortex, and one of the capacities that we have as a result of having evolved a bit further than our sort of other species in terms of, sometimes we talk about the reptile brain. Anyway, the other thing I would just mention here is the importance of the media. And it's fascinating to me because I'm not sure if, I guess I can still remember driving up to Albany to visit my grandchildren and my daughter and her family. But it's so fascinating to even listen to public radio and keep track of how many of these stories make me nervous or worried versus how many of these stories are reassuring about the goodness of life and the beauty and the opportunities that we all have. And the reality is that the media has learned a long time ago that people pay attention and want to listen to the next news show if there's something going on that is a source of fear or threat that they need to be thoughtful about. So finding a way of working with the media rather than somehow being a victim of the media is something that I think will be important for us to consider. Next slide. So peace, and this will bring me to this topic. And this is an interesting story. So I was actually on my way to Israel to spend some time with Ruth Feldman, and we also had started this program that I was telling you about before, where we were actually working with the Israeli and Palestinian communities to bring their children together and have joint projects. And I had my flight arranged, and one of my friends from Turkey called me up, Yanki Yazgan, and he said, Jim, you've met with this foundation before, but I'd like to have you meet with them again. They have a real question that they'd like you to address from a neuroscience perspective. And I said, well, what's the question, Yankobe? And so it turned out that the question was that they had been doing these early childhood interventions in rural parts of Turkey and in poor parts of Istanbul, where they brought together groups of mothers and basically and their children, and they had a curriculum that was developed by individuals who were experts in developmental psychology. And they had this curriculum, and basically it was bringing to, and this comes back to where we're sitting today in terms of the club that we're in here in Toronto, in the sense of having groups of mothers coming together to discuss and to have a curriculum with regard to how they raise their children, but also to ask the question, who are you? What do you want to achieve in life? What is the nature of the relationships that you have with other members of your family, particularly your husband and other individuals in the community? And is there anything that needs to change with regard to that? The other thing that's very common in terms of the practices that you see in many parts of the world is what we call harsh parenting. So it turns out that, and this is true certainly in our country, it's still true in many areas of the world today, but if you ask the question, how do you interact with your child when your child does something that is upsetting to you, it's not unusual for there to be spanking, hitting. And actually, another one of my friends here in Toronto, Harriet McMillan, has been, and she's at McMaster, a wonderful person, and she's been focused on this issue for some time. I've also been working with one of the colleagues that she's been actively working with regard to an early childhood intervention, the Nurse-Family Partnership that David Olds has been running, And she's basically been looking at the long-term outcomes that you see with that particular intervention. In any case, the reason that they wanted to talk with me is that they have been asking the mothers at some point in time how they could improve their program. And one of their suggestions was, perhaps you could actually involve our husbands. Because so many of the interventions that are being done are ones that are based on what the mother's up to with the child as opposed to what's happening in the larger family structure. And what they were surprised by was that when they started the father groups, and this is probably going back at least a decade or two, it turned out that the fathers who came together became friends even though they came from different social and cultural backgrounds. So there were Kurds as well as traditional Turks that were actually involved in the program. And they were asking the question, what on earth could be going on in the brains of these men to become friends, even though they come from these different backgrounds? What's also interesting about these programs is that typically, given the social support and the social capital that is built, they actually begin to say, I'm not sure I want the program to end. This is 25 sessions, but I want to keep going. And we actually have other programs going on in Brazil right now that are being funded by the Gates Foundation. And interestingly, we've just been having conversations with folks in Riyadh, having a program actually in Saudi Arabia. And what's interesting about it is that it's again the women that are really wanting to make this move forward and to make a change in their society. And they're hoping that if they can actually have an impact on how the children are being raised, that may actually come to pass. And I have another good friend in New Haven by the name of Kyle Pruitt who's been doing a father support program out in California, but now it's in Canada actually, in Calgary and Alberta, but also in other parts of the world as well. And it's a co-parenting program where both mothers and fathers, as well as their children, are participating. But the other thing I did, and this is something I'm going to make a recommendation to all of you, and particularly to the people that have been involved with Empathy for Peace, is that even though this isn't exactly what you had in mind, it's very consistent with what you're doing and where you're at and where you want to be. And that is that it might be worthwhile to actually contact the folks over at the Ernst Strugman Forum. This is over in Frankfurt, Germany. And what we did several years ago was we actually brought together over 40 scholars from across the world, also practitioners. And there were some background papers that we had people read. But then we came together in Frankfurt, and basically the whole issue was, what do we know about early childhood and peace building? What are the data? What is the research? What is the scientific information? What do we don't know? And what are the important questions that still need to be answered from a research perspective? And this book was the product of that, and maybe I'll start over here with David, and you can take a look at that. But I was with the group that had to do with the basic biology, so there we actually had people like Sue Carter, but other people who were very familiar with bonding with regard to the mammalian species that were working together, and what about the stress-response relationship and all of these other things, and the role of the immune system, which has been, I gave a talk to folks in Chile remotely, I guess earlier this month, about the role of the immune system with regard to normal brain development as well as in neuropsychiatric conditions as well. And what was fascinating about it is there are certain cells that migrate into the brain that are critically important. I guess my favorite one is the microglia, but we won't go down that road. In any case, that was the first group. No presentations. Sitting around tables discussing what do we know. And there was one person who was the rapporteur who would be keeping notes and being thoughtful about what is it that we feel like we do have some knowledge base on, what is it that we don't really know, and this would be an important question to answer, and how best can we move forward. And then there was a group looking at basically normal brain development in humans, and what do we know about that? What about the role of sort of investing in child behaviors in terms of what the promise of that might be? And then the last group was actually practitioners looking at, well, what do we know in terms of what are the quality programs that are out there, how can they actually be brought to a sustainable level, and what are some of the factors that may be important in terms of that regard. So that's what this book is all about. And I think in some ways organizing one of these forums where you're actually bringing people together who have shared interests, who come from a variety of backgrounds, and asking the question, what do we know about empathy and peace? What are some of the important questions that still need to be addressed? And what are some of the implications in terms of programs that might be supported in terms of being able to move this forward if there is a credible scientific basis for the work that's being done? So that was one of the products of this partnership that we had with this foundation in Turkey. The other one is actually this Early Childhood Peace Consortium. And that's basically bringing together practitioners, and here UNICEF has been a really incredibly important partner as well, and now Queen's University in Belfast, but all sorts of people across the globe, and we're very excited to have folks from Harvard and NYU and others join us as well. And we can come back to this, but this is actually, and it's fascinating, this is Reema Masala, and Reema actually was born in Jerusalem, and she's the current CEO of this particular NGO that we formed, called the Early Childhood Peace Consortium. And she's now a Jordanian citizen, but she lives in New York, right across from the UN Center. And she was part of UNICEF for decades, and actually mostly working in sub-Saharan Africa. So the other thing about peace is that it's not one thing. It's a whole process, and we come back again to this reality that things are constantly changing, that we're all interconnected. And some of the issues that I think are critically important that we'll be talking more about in Belfast have to do not only with direct violence, but also with what we call structural violence. And this is actually a concept that was probably best articulated by this Norwegian fellow, Johan Galtung. And basically this is saying that when you have inequalities within the society, where there are some people that are advantaged and other people that are disadvantaged, economically and the rest of it, it sets the stage for that structural violence that can have a real impact in terms of what the experience is for families sort of moving forward. And this has actually been part of what we've been discussing with regard to how to best invest in some of the community programs that are here in Canada. But I'm looking forward to the continuing discussions that we will have in terms of early childhood programs and the potential impact that they might have in terms of peace building and violence prevention. And why don't we just run through a few more of these, and then I'll stop. So social cohesion is a big issue, and it's vertical in terms of not only how the parents relate to their children, but also what's going on in the community. And then when we think at the national level, and we'd really like to have an impact at that level if we could, as well as the horizontal cohesion. Next slide. So that's just a picture of Siobhan Fitzpatrick, who is now the CEO of Early Years, and Paul Connolly, who's organizing this event in Belfast in a couple of days. Next slide. Next slide. So this was the Achev hypothesis. Why are these men friends now, even though they came from different cultural and religious backgrounds? Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. So again, maternal health, nutrition, and safety, responsive care, stimulation, secure attachment, self-regulation, pro-social values, peace, equity, intergroup empathy, respect, trust, social cohesion. This is how we actually can create a more peaceful world. And I do believe that if we actually make the investment in early childhood, we can have a real impact. Next slide. So, take-home message, we need to take action to make our world a better place for our children and future generations, and next steps include commitment to refine, adapt, and implement in a sustainable fashion early childhood programs of proven value across the globe. And this will require policymakers at the national and community levels to invest in this important domain. So I think with that I'll end.